Today we lay our grandmother to rest, the backbone of our family, the creator of generations of grandkids, started with Carol Franklin. My name is Carlos Franklin, from Mississippi, born and raised. I'm the youngest of all of my siblings. To take you back to how it all started, my grandfather, Charles Franklin, was a Tuskegee Airman, second lieutenant in World War II, but that was a small part of my grandfather's life. The biggest part was the families that he took care of and raised when he made it back stateside. Before he went off to war, my grandfather had a son by a young lady named Carol Williams. Carol Williams was a twin. Her identical sister name was Carrie Williams, who also had a son by my grandfather. The night before my grandfather went off to the war, it was a big party the Williams sisters threw for the town and some of the men that were going off to fight in the war. The Williams sisters inherited a bar that their father left to them when he passed away. The bar was attached to the bottom part of the house. It was a gold mine in our community because we were the only black bar in Mississippi at the time. Live music, top shelf alcohol, and family owned. William D's was the place to be. The night of the party, my grandmother decided to take my grandfather upstairs for a going-away gift, and my aunt decided to stay down and close up and make sure everyone left so she could lock up. After about an hour and a half, my grandfather comes back downstairs to grab his jacket so he could leave. My Aunt Carrie asked him, "Why are you leaving?" He says, "I have to see my mother and father before I leave." Then she says, "Just have one last drink with me." She says, "Does my sister know you're leaving?" He says, "No, she was asleep. I didn't want to wake her." She then asked, "Are you going to marry my sister when you get back?" My grandfather said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, with that answer, I need help sleeping tonight also." She asked him how much gas he had left in his tank. My grandfather said, "I have plenty." She grabbed his hand and they went upstairs. That night, my grandfather impregnated my grandmother and her sister. They both had boys, and they had them weeks apart. My aunt had always told my grandmother that the father of her child died in the war. A few years after the war, my grandfather was recruited to fly a few secret missions. So by the time he made it back to the States, both of the boys were 5 years old. They damn near looked like twins. Carrie wrote my grandfather a few years back telling him that he was the father of her child and that this is our secret. My aunt later moved across town. She then told him in the letter, "Because this is our secret. I want everything that you will provide for my sister provided for me." For the next 10 years, my grandfather kept a consistent relationship with both sisters, but my grandmother was who he married. He then had 3 more children with my grandmother and had 4 children with her sister. He purchased a lot of farmland, so he made real good money. He was the backbone of our family. He purchased a small plane that he would fly away in for a few days, once or twice a month. My father said they never knew where he was going. Around 1955, my grandfather had accumulated over 200 acres of land and owned 2 more airplanes. He started teaching his older sons to fly. One weekend, my grandfather flew out with his sons, and my grandmother was approached at the house by 2 armed men with suits on. They knocked at the door. My grandmother answered, "How may I help you?" The 2 men said they were looking for Charles Franklin and that they are with the CIA. My grandmother said, "He's not here right now." They then asked if they could come inside to talk. She said, "No, sir, you cannot, but I will tell him you came by." She got both of their information, and they turned to walk away. She watched them sit in their car taking pictures of the property, and then they pulled off. After a few days, my grandfather returned. My grandmother told him 2 white men with suits on came by. She asked, "Is there something I need to be worried about? Is there something you need to tell me?" He said, "Carol, I will handle it." 2 days later, the 2 white men returned. My grandfather talks to them, standing on the porch for a while. Then he gets into the back seat of their car, and they drive towards the barn where the planes are. My grandmother then grabbed my grandfather's rifle and eased out the back door. My grandfather's oldest son, which is my dad, was working on one of the planes. When he saw them pull up, he slid down in the seat to hide. He heard one of the white men tell my grandfather that we can see that you're having issues completing your part of the deal. My grandfather replies, I paid you well over the amount agreed upon. I just want my life back. I'm done. One of the white men pulled his pistol, pointing it at my grandfather's head. He said, everything you have, we made it possible for you and your family to live like this, and you will fly for us and traffic for us as long as we need you to. Or we will kill everyone on this farm and burn it to the ground. My dad, which was still hiding, dropped the wrench, and one of the white men fired a shot towards him, striking him in the chest. My grandfather ran towards my dad. The CIA agent said, I'm sorry, that was an accident. I thought we were the only ones in here. One of the agents then said, I'm sure he will be all right. Little did they know my grandmother was standing at the entrance holding my grandfather's rifle. She heard everything. She shot both of the agents and then turned the rifle on my grandfather, holding my dad while he was dying. My grandfather told her, put the gun down. She then said, you did this. He closed my dad's eyes, then walked towards my grandmother and grabbed the gun and set it down while crying, holding each other. She asked him who was going to come looking for the two agents. My grandfather said nobody. This deal was just between us. They pulled their car into the barn, put both bodies in the trunk, and then they carried my dad back down to the house. They laid my dad on the table and they called all the family down to see him. My grandfather said, because of this moment, we will never talk about this again. We're going to say our final goodbyes, and we're going to bury him ourselves. Later that night, they started digging the holes that they used to bury the two agents. As for the car, they drove it to the next city over and set it on fire. That night, everyone sat around the dinner table in silence. My mom at the time was 17 years old. She couldn't bear staying around knowing what happened to my dad, so she left me with my grandparents. Till this day, I've never seen my mother again. My grandparents raised me, and my aunt played a significant role in my life. After my grandfather passed away, she told me the truth about her and my grandfather, and why she stayed so distant. Because of my grandfather, I now own Franklin Refinery here in Mississippi, a supermarket, and also a funeral home thanks to Mr. and Mrs. Franklin. My grandfather, Charles Franklin, ran drugs from Mexico to the United States from 1951 to 1959 under the guidance of the CIA. The money he made started businesses that are still thriving till this day. My grandmother was responsible for over 50% of black-owned businesses in Mississippi. The moral of this story is, where there is pain, there's keys that need to be flown in. Let's get this money.
Borderline Crazy TV.